Can buying a high-end gaming mouse make you better at FPS games? No, that's dumb. However, finding the right mouse shape with good quality internals can help to unlock a person's potential, in combination with good practice and identifying and correcting their bad habits. I used to have terrible tracking, 27% average LG in Quake, but after a lot of practice and some peripheral experimentation, I can now hit in the upper 40s and sometimes low 50s. So the G-Wolves HSK Pro ended up being the mouse for me, and after just over a year of constant use, I want to talk about it. First and foremost, I am one of those psychopaths that immediately remove the side buttons and scroll wheel because I just don't use them, so I can't tell you anything about those. The main clicks have given me no trouble at all though, even set to its 0 millisecond debounce time. No double clicking issues with the zippy 50M switches on my copy. This is also a first batch unit, so the two batteries that were included were the faulty ones that could potentially catch fire while charging. I immediately swapped that out for an aftermarket 270 mAh to extend its life at 4000 Hz. I get about 20 hours on a single charge. This mouse is very small, weighing just under 30 grams in its stock configuration, and it's very short at 74 millimeters. The overall design encourages a fingertip grip that could best be summarized as pen-like, allowing the user to make fine adjustments with very little effort using only their fingers. Before the HSK Pro had come to the market, I was already trying some other fingertip-oriented mice, like this PCBR from Piranha Mouse Mods, and this M2K-inspired G305 conversion shell called the SDI 305 that I found on Thingiverse. Both of these designs were okay, but I ended up not really liking them. The SDI 305, for example, has a shape that flares out at the front, narrows at the back, and has aggressively sloped sides that made it very unstable, hard to make vertical aim adjustments, and just awkward to lift off the pad. The PCBR didn't have these issues, but the shape was so blocky that prolonged use became uncomfortable, the AAA battery placement being in the rear made it very ass-heavy, and the main clicks are super tall. The HSK Pro had none of these issues out of the box, and once I placed my aftermarket battery further forward in the body, directly above the sensor, the weight balance ended up being perfectly centered. The buttons are nice and low, the side curvature is designed for actual human hands, and after a short adjustment period it now feels very stable during tracking, flicking, and static aim. Now let's talk about what the fuck is going on here. The stock skates for the HSK are totally fine, perfectly serviceable. But after a bit of time, I found that the liftoff distance, even when set to 1mm, was so high up that I was having trouble with the sensor tracking long after I had left the pad and just wanted it to stop. These are 1.35mm thick guitar picks that are made of Delrin, also known as POM or polyoxymethylene plastic. You might recognize POM if you're a custom keyboard enthusiast, as it's a very low friction but high durability plastic that's being used in a lot of boutique mechanical keyboard switches, specifically for those properties. The feel of these POM pick skates on my SkyPad 2.0 is functionally identical to standard PTFE, but they haven't worn down at all like PTFE does, and the thickness brought my liftoff distance down to, I shit you not, microns. The sensor will only start tracking if the skates are making physical contact with the pad. Now, a lot of people say that the 4000 Hz polling rate doesn't do anything and it's placebo, but I think a lot of the people who say that just aren't using it properly, or maybe aren't even capable of perceiving it. If you're on a 144 Hz monitor and you play on 400 DPI, then no, you won't get any of the benefit of 4000 Hz except the slightly faster click latency. If you're on a 240 Hz or higher monitor and getting stable high frames, playing at 1600 DPI or higher, then you have a much better chance to see or feel the smoother input. According to Zogel's tests at Tech Power Up, the 3395 sensor implementation in the HSK Pro doesn't introduce any kind of smoothing until 9000 DPI, which is ridiculously high. Any DPI values lower than that will be pure, unfiltered motion data, which is great. DPI values that high will fully saturate the polling rate at all times, even with the smallest movements. I personally use a 1600 eDPI, which is about a 26 cm per 360. To get the most out of the polling rate, I use 8000 DPI in the mouse's firmware and then multiply it by 0.2 in raw Excel. This gives me the same 1600 eDPI on the desktop and in games, but with a fully saturated 4000 Hz polling rate. Small micro adjustments will push the polling rate to near max immediately. The responsiveness by doing this on my setup feels insanely smooth while leaving windows and in-game sensitivity calculations exactly the same. To demonstrate this, I'll go to 400 eDPI. So 400 in the HSK Pro's firmware and 1.0 in raw Excel. And this equates to a 104 centimeter per 360, which is a ridiculously low sensitivity. The amount of motion that is required to even break 1000 hertz here is pretty insane. I am covering a fair chunk of my mouse pad by doing this right now, and this is much lower than what I normally use. In order to fully saturate that 4000 hertz, I need to swipe my mouse across my entire desk in these giant circles to even touch 4000 hertz, which is just not going to happen for most players in any scenario using 400 DPI. Moving back to my preferred 1600 eDPI, using 8000 DPI in the mouse's firmware, and setting a 0.2 multiplier in raw Excel, well, I'll let the results speak for themselves. You guys should be able to tell. The amount of motion required to saturate 4000 hertz is down to like 2 centimeters at most in tiny little circles. So DPI plays a huge part in polling rate. All in all, I really like this HSK Pro. I think it's a great mouse. You might like it too if you're considering moving to a fingertip grip or already use fingertip grip. It's maybe worth looking into. There is the Keychron M4, which is a newer, cheaper alternative, but it's not shaped quite the same. If you do go for a G-Wolves, just hope you never have to contact customer support.